BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be responding to Dr. Thomas Bond's report on Jack the Ripper, looking at the book Killer Psychopaths by Paul Roland, and reacting to Steve Blomer's appearance on the House of Mystery radio show. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com, and I am your host, Black Box Ned. So, in case you didn't hear the Tuesday show here on Black Box Online Radio, which is called True Crime Talk Radio in the Morning, I was discussing the book Killer Psychopaths by Paul Roland, and it's a book that surprised me a little bit because it's advertised as a psychological profiling book and criminal profiling book, and Paul Roland states that he is somebody who worked with the FBI profiling unit under John Douglas, who is perhaps the most famous American criminal profiler of them all, and this book talks about several different true crime cases. I was hoping to use it for an episode of Zodiac Monday, and looking at some psychological possibilities in the Zodiac killer mystery, but I found that perhaps it wasn't suitable because of the way that it's written. However, there is a section on the book that is dedicated to Jack the Ripper, and that's what I would like to begin with for this episode. And the entire report of an individual named Dr. Thomas Bond is included in the book, because as Paul Roland tries to show, Dr. Thomas Bond made his own profile for Jack the Ripper, how he believes the Ripper operated, his observations about Jack the Ripper. Dr. Thomas Bond is the individual who performed the autopsy on Mary Kelly, the final victim of the Ripper. I would like to read his report, but in the book Killer Psychopaths, there is a quotation that precedes the report, and that precedes the report, and I would like to read that here. I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil. Once standing as my sponsor, beside the bed, where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since. And that is a quotation from H.H. Holmes, an American serial killer who is a Jack the Ripper suspect in his own right. And that's what begins the Jack the Ripper section. But to introduce Dr. Thomas Bond's report, there's also a quotation here from Paul Roland that says, Dr. Bond used his experience to determine if there was any evidence to support the assumption that the killings were the work of one man. Bond submitted his report on November 10th of 1888, the day after he had performed the post-mortem examination on what we assume was the Ripper's final victim, Mary Kelly. And I'm going to read the report of Dr. Thomas Bond right now. I beg to report that I have read the notes of the 4 Whitechapel murders, vis-a-vis Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, Berner Street, and Mitre Square. Bucks Row, of course, was August 31st with the murder of Polly Nichols. Hanbury Street was, of course, September 8th with the murder of Annie Chapman. Berner Street was, of course, September 30th with the murder of Liz Stride. And Mitre Square was also on September 30th with the murder of Catherine Eddowes. I have also made a post-mortem examination of the mutilated remains of the woman found in a small room in Dorset Street. That would be Mary Kelly. Number 1. All 5 murders were no doubt committed by the same hand. In the first 4, the throats appeared to have been cut from left to right. In the last case, owing to the extensive mutilation, it is impossible to say what direction the fatal cut was made, but arterial blood was found on the wall and splashes, close to where the victim's head must have been lying. Number 2. All the circumstances surrounding the murders led me to inform the opinion that the woman must have been lying down when murdered. In every case, the throat was cut first. Number 3. In the 4 murders of which I have seen the notes, I cannot form a definitive opinion as the time that had elapsed between the murder and the discovery of the body. In one case, that of the Berner Street, the discovery appears to have been made immediately after the dead. In Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, and Mitre Square, 3 or 4 hours could have elapsed. In Dorset Street, The body was lying on the bed at the time of my visit, 2 o'clock, quite naked and mutilated, as in the annexed report. Rigor mortis had set in, but increased during the progress of the examination. From this, it is difficult to say with any degree of certainty the exact time that had elapsed since death, as periods vary from 6 to 12 hours before rigidity sets in. The body was comparatively cold at 2 o'clock, and the remains of a recently taken meal were found in the stomach and scattered about the intestines. It is therefore pretty certain that the woman must have been dead for about 12 hours, and the partly digested food indicated that the death took place 3 or 4 hours after the food was taken in, so 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning would be probable for the time of murder. Number 4. In all cases there appears to be no evidence of struggling, and the attacks were probably so sudden, in such a position that the woman could neither resist nor cry out. In the Dorset Street case, the corner of the sheet, to the right of the woman's head, was cut and saturated with blood, indicating that the face may have been covered with the sheet at the time of the attack. Number 5. In the first 4 cases, the murderer must have attacked from the right side of the victim. In the Dorset Street case, he must have attacked from in front and from the left, as there would be no room for him between the wall and the part of the bed on which the woman was lying. Again, the blood had flowed down the right side of the woman and spurted onto the wall. Number 6. The murderer would not necessarily be splashed or covered with blood, but his hands and arms must have been covered, and parts of his clothing must certainly have been smeared with blood. Number 7. The mutilations in each case except the Berners Street one were all of the same character and show clearly that in all the murders the object was mutilation. Number 8. In each case the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific nor anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he doesn't even know the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer or any person accustomed to cutting up dead animals. Number 9. The instrument must have been a strong knife, at least 6 inches long, very sharp, pointed at the top, and about an inch in width. It may have been a clasped knife, butcher's knife, or a surgeon's knife. I think it was no doubt a straight knife. The murderer must have been a man of physical strength and great coolness and daring. There is no evidence that he had an accomplice. He must, in my opinion, be a man subject to periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania. The character of the mutilations indicate that the man may have been in a condition, sexually, that could be called satyriasis. It is of course possible that the homicidal impulse may have developed from a revengeful or brooding condition of the mind, or that religious mania may have been the origin of the disease, but I do not think either hypothesis is likely. The murderer in external appearance is quite likely to be a quiet, inoffensive-looking man, probably middle-aged, neatly and respectfully dressed. I don't think that he is in the habit of wearing... I do think that he must be in the habit of wearing a cloak or overcoat, or he could have hardly escaped notice in the streets with blood on his hands or clothes that was visible. Number 11. Assuming that the murderer to be such a person I have just described, he would probably be solitary and eccentric in his habits, although he is most likely to be a man without a regular occupation, but with some small income or pension. He is possibly living among respectable persons who have some knowledge of his character and habits, and who may have grounds for suspicion that he is not quite right in his mind at times. Such persons would be unwilling to communicate their suspicions to the police for fear of trouble or notoriety, whereas, if there was a prospect of reward, it might overcome their scruples. I am, dear sir, yours faithfully, Dr. Thomas Bond. Now, goodness, where do we even begin with this? And I completely agree with Paul Roland that this is something that we should discuss, because this is not just a medical examiner's report. This isn't just talking about the condition of Mary Kelly's body. This is talking very clearly about how Dr. Thomas Bond perceives the Ripper to be. And this is one that points out that the first 4 murders appeared all have been having the Ripper cut the victim in the same way. Their throats are cut in the same direction, but with the murder of Mary Kelly, it was impossible to say. I think that's a totally reasonable observation. Mary Kelly was almost murdered beyond recognition. Now, one point, though, that I find to be extremely shocking, though, is when Dr. Thomas Bond says that, I'm just gonna say right here that that whole thing about how death may have occurred 3 or 4 hours before the bodies were discovered in the first 4 victims. I just think that that's absolutely false, and we all know that to be the case now, that the victims who were killed by Jack the Ripper were discovered much more quickly than that. Say, for example, with the murder of Polly Nichols, you have her body discovered by Charles Lechmere at some time between 3:35 and 3:45 in the morning. Then Robert Paul arrives, then they walk down the road, and then they alert P.C. Meissen about the woman who has been found bloody in the street. P.C. Neal also arrives even before P.C. Meissen, and that all happens within the hour, so there's absolutely not 3 to 4 hours. The same with Annie Chapman, and even with Catherine Eddowes, 3 or 4 hours did not pass before the bodies were found. It appears that he is reading some notes from things that were going on at the time, and of course communication was not being shared completely. So this is another very strong point where he shows that perhaps the Ripper is completely aware of what he's doing. And this is getting away from some of the crime scene observations and talking more about the character, personality, and mindset of the Ripper. But it seems very clear and apparent that Jack the Ripper knew exactly what he was doing. Even if he had a mental illness, he was aware of his faculties at that point. If what Dr. Thomas Bond says is correct, that is that the Ripper may have removed his overcoat when he's committing the murders, and he is going to have blood all over his arms and hands. Not necessarily everywhere, but definitely on his arms and hands to a very large portion. And especially after the murder of Mary Kelly. I mean, you heard about all of this blood spatter evidence that went on inside the room at Miller's Court, Dorset Street. That would mean that a lot of the blood is probably going to be on the Ripper, and very easily he could have just concealed it all by putting on a very large overcoat. He could have put on gloves, or he could have also put his hands in his pockets even. I know that sounds like a very, very simple statement, but I mean, I think that is something that the Ripper would have been doing. Now, some of these things here, though, that I think are just a little bit difficult to say with certainty, but I do appreciate that a contemporary individual is trying to make determinations about the Ripper's mindset. I'm going to read one quotation again. It is, of course, possible that the homicidal impulse may have developed from a revengeful or brooding condition of the mind, or that religious mania may have been the original disease, but I do not think that either hypothesis is likely, and overall it seems like I think he's trying to say that the only thing that's driving the Ripper to kill is some type of sexual stimulation that he is getting from attacking these women and cutting apart their bodies. Dr. Thomas Bond also stated very clearly that he believed that the primary focus was mutilation. And now this is also perhaps the biggest thing that people can take away from Dr. Thomas Bond's report. He does not believe that the Ripper had anatomical knowledge, and not only did he not believe that, he stated that with such passion, saying that Jack the Ripper didn't even have the knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer, saying this was absolutely not a medical doctor, this was absolutely not a butcher. So that is going to raise a lot of questions in regards to suspects. Let's say hypothetically Dr. Thomas Bond is right. Hypothetically. Think about how many Jack the Ripper suspects out there were either medical doctors or had some occupation like a butcher. So if those people are indeed like living up to their name, then Dr. Thomas Bond, and let's say hypothetically he's correct, then they would not fit into this profile at all. They should not be considered as strong suspects. But we have to remember that this is a profile, and a profile is like an educated guess. It's one interpretation of the evidence. The other things that are very surprising here is that he believes that Jack the Ripper was unemployed. He believes that Jack the Ripper was being aided by his family. He also believes that Jack the Ripper was an older person. And, I mean, let's just go back to see right here. He is possibly living among respectable persons. He is most likely a man without a regular occupation, but with some small income or pension. The respectable persons that he lives with have some knowledge of his character and habits, and may have grounds for suspicion that he is not quite right in the mind at times. Such persons would probably be unwilling to communicate. So, Jack the Ripper's unemployed. Jack the Ripper, well, he is either unemployed or he has a very small amount of work. Let's be clear, he would not have regular employment. So I think that that is also something that is just, it's an interesting viewpoint on this subject. I don't necessarily know if we have enough evidence to say that Jack the Ripper was either underemployed, unemployed, or didn't have regular employment for the following reasons. These crimes are occurring after dark. These crimes are occurring in the early AM hours, and you could say that about all of them. Even when you have crimes like Liz Stride being murdered at 12:56 or 12:58 AM, or you have crimes like Annie Chapman being murdered closer to 6 AM, like 5:30 to 6 AM, then this is all the early AM hours. Someone could have been doing this at night, and then they could have been doing something else during the daytime, like a job or occupation. I don't necessarily think we have enough information to say that Jack the Ripper was unemployed, underemployed, or did not have regular employment. But maybe Dr. Thomas Bond is onto something. I mean, he was a contemporary, and I am not. And this is another thing, though, that I want to add before I look at Paul Roland's commentary. And this is getting away from psychological profiling. This might be something that's even more important to discuss and consider, and that is the knife that was used. Because Dr. Thomas Bond can speculate as much as he wants, the same way that I can, and the same way that you can. But here is something, though, from the medical examiner who actually is reading the reports and examined Mary Kelly's body. The instrument must have been a strong knife, at least 6 inches long, very sharp, pointed at the top, and about an inch in width. It may have been a clasp knife, a butcher's knife, or surgeon's knife. I think it was no doubt a straight knife. And this is something, though, that is going to be very important because there are people out there who say that there were multiple knives used. There are people out there who say that there were curved blades used. And the first two that come to mind were Patricia Cornwell, who proposes that Jack the Ripper was using a curved blade called the Indian Peshkabs. And then there's also Randy Williams, author of Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror, that states that the four victims, such as Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly, were murdered with a 6-inch knife, and that Liz Stride was murdered with a 9-inch knife, 9-inch blade to be precise. And there's also kind of an urban myth that's going around that the four women that I just listed off were murdered with a longer knife, and Liz Stride was murdered with a shorter, rounded edge knife. And that just appears to be a type of misinformation that's been going around. It doesn't appear that there's any evidence to support that Liz Stride was murdered with a longer knife or a shorter knife. But Dr. Thomas Bond definitely didn't think so. He thinks that this is one straight-bladed knife at least 6 inches long. Okay, though. What do you think? What do you think about any of this? Like, let me just throw these to you as challenge questions. Number one, do you believe that Jack the Ripper had regular employment? Number two, do you believe that all of the crimes were committed with the same knife? Number three, do you believe that Jack the Ripper had assistance from his family and that they were covering up from him? What do you think about all of this here? Because it seems like what Dr. Thomas Bond is suggesting is Jack the Ripper has a family, and the family can recognize that he's going crazy. They're completely aware of his dangerous behavior. They might be doing things to control him, confining him to his house, even like tying him to the bed or something. I'm using my imagination at that point. But they are trying to prevent him from getting caught. Maybe that's why Jack the Ripper was never captured. What do you think about all that? And just let me know in the comments section down below. Now let's get to some of Paul Roland's comments here. Unfortunately, the authorities refused to take Bond's advice regarding the reward, and the perpetrator was never caught. That refers to this statement at the end. Whereas if a prospect of reward might overcome their scruples, okay, the family's confining Jack the Ripper to the house, but they might turn him over if money was involved. Of course, I mean, everybody has their limits. It is possible that he was arrested on an unrelated matter or committed to an asylum, or even took his own life, as the series of prostitute murders ended with the Dorset Street slaying. The extent of which Mary Kelly was mutilated beyond all recognition suggests that the murderer's mind gave way. And to be very clear, she was not murdered beyond recognition, because Joseph Barnett, the friend and former lover, ex-boyfriend, let's just call him that, of Mary Kelly, did identify her. So, he did identify her based on certain features, so she was not murdered beyond recognition, almost beyond recognition. In clinical terms, his personality disintegrated under the internal pressure. In such a state, he would not have been fit to be prosecuted. So I think what Paul Roland is trying to say is maybe Jack the Ripper just reached a breaking point, After the murder of Mary Kelly, he became so insane that he was committed to an asylum. His family could have restrained him, as I've already said multiple times. Or also, maybe his mental state changed and he wasn't necessarily somebody who's prowling the streets looking for victims. Maybe he sat down and started eating food out of the gutter. Who knows? So let's look at some of this here. Psychopathia sexualis is the name of the sections. Serial killers are not a modern phenomenon. In the early age, the savage mutilations carried out by what were known as lust murderers might have been attributed to vampires, werewolves, or the malevolent creatures of the night. In referring to the Ripper murders, in a later edition of the book, it is noted that it is probable that he first cut the throats of the victims, he then ripped open the abdomen and groped along the intestines. In some instances, he cut off the genitals and carried them away. In others, he only tore them to pieces and left them behind. He does not seem to have had sexual intercourse with his victims, but very likely the murderous act and subsequent mutilations of the corpse were a sexual act. Okay, well, most people agree with that the Ripper was somebody who received some type of sexual stimulation from the mutilations, not the murders. Because if the Ripper did kill Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the same night, that would show that he wanted to mutilate Liz Stride, but was unable to do so. He's interrupted in some way, or as Stephen Hunter even proposed, maybe he just thought he couldn't get away with it, so he just fled the scene, and he slit her throat, though, when she was murdered, but then he had to find another victim, Catherine Eddowes. I absolutely agree that mutilations would be the prime cause for the Ripper's activities. Now, as far as cutting off the genitals, I mean, I think that what this is referring to is the mutilations of the genitals and the uterus being stolen. And, I mean, let's just be clear, the Ripper is cutting these women apart, and he is taking organs from multiple crime scenes, particularly Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, and of course Mary Kelly's heart was stolen. He does not seem to have had sexual intercourse with the victims. Most people would agree with that, but some people, like let's say for example Russell Edwards, believe that the Ripper ejaculated during his crimes, particularly after the Mitre Square murder, and he left a semen stain behind on the shawl of the victim. Now let's talk about the letters, and again these are the comments of Paul Roland, author of the book Killer Psychopaths. As for the authenticity of Jack the Ripper's letters, such as the Dear Boss letter, which was posted and sent to the Central News Agency at the height of terror, which gave rise to the notorious nickname by which the Ripper is remembered, former FBI profiler John Douglas dismissed them out of hand, as did the Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, who had been in charge of the original investigation. It's too organized, too indicative of intelligence and rational thought, and far too cutesy, Douglas has said. An offender of this type would never think of his actions as funny little games, or say something like, "My knife is so nice and sharp." Now, this might sound like nitpicking, this might sound like unfairness, and some people also might be like, "Black Box Ned, who are you to challenge John Douglas, the FBI profiler?" But when he says these things here about being organized, I mean, let's just read that exact statement one more time. It's too organized, indicative of intelligence. I'm not convinced that the Ripper wasn't completely organized in his mind. Think about everything that we have just said so far, that the Ripper is aware of what he's doing, that indicative of intelligence? Who's to say that the Ripper wasn't intelligent? I mean, it seems like the Ripper is very cunning. The Ripper is very aware of what he's doing. He's very thoughtful with his actions. He's putting an enormous amount of effort into not being caught. I'm not convinced at all that the Ripper wasn't somebody who was organized with his thinking and intelligent. I just want to be clear about that. And of course, John Douglas might be referring to the crimes when he says organized versus disorganized. The part that I do agree with, and mostly, I think John Douglas might be spot on with this. It's cutesy. Absolutely, the Dear Boss letter is cutesy. My knife is so nice and sharp. They say I'm a doctor now, ha ha. There's absolutely this type of playful language that has been used in the letters. But regular listeners of Ripper Wednesday will know where I stand on the letters. I guess you could say about a year ago, at this time a year ago, If you had asked me, do I think the letters are authentic, I would have said 99% no. 99% I did not think that the letters were authentic. I even appeared on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belgique talking about Jack the Ripper, and I was asked that question. I said, no, I don't think Jack the Ripper wrote any of the letters for all of the reasons that I've just stated. But the thing that I always come back to is the Dear Boss letter was postmarked on September 27th of 1888, and then another crime happens, two crimes actually happened, on September 30th, 3 days later. Although the letter is dated September 25th, it's mailed and received on September 27th. How did a hoaxer know that the killer would strike again 3 days later if the killer hasn't operated in 3 weeks, not since September 8th? And I'm really not sure how that works. Is it all just like fitting together nicely? Was this just a convenient hoax that happened to line up with the real time frame? Was the Ripper aware of the receiving of the Dear Boss letter when someone was pretending to be him? I mean, I shouldn't even call him the Ripper at that point. We have to call him the Whitechapel murderer. And that's why I had a drop. Instead of being 99% certain that the Ripper didn't write any of the letters, I'm about 60% certain that the Ripper didn't write the letters. And I would love to know what you guys think. You can put your responses in the comments section down below. Profiling a phantom. On to the next section. On the 100th anniversary of the Whitechapel murders in 1988, two of the FBI's leading profilers, John Douglas and Roy Hazelwood, lent their extensive experience in tracking serial predators and serial killers to the creation of a psychological profile of Jack the Ripper for a television show that was hosted by Peter Ustinov. Considering the case solely on the facts as recorded in the official autopsy reports and Metropolitan Police files, they concluded that the Ripper was a white male in his mid to late 20s, of average intelligence, whose success in evading detection was due to simple luck. Actually, I've read off the John Douglas psychological profile here on Black Box Online Radio for a previous episode, and I thought that he stated that the exact age that he would pen on him was 30. So late 20s, early 30s, but this says even mid 20s, mid to late 20s. That is in strong contrast to Dr. Thomas Bond, who seemed to think that the Ripper was an older person. His very ordinariness had enabled him to melt into the crowded courts, teeming streets, and dark alleyways of the capital. And Dr. Thomas Bond would be in agreement with that. And this goes to show that the Ripper is not so terrifying. Like, there was this one story that I read off on Ripper Wednesday where someone was saying, oh, all women would be absolutely horrified if they saw the Ripper's face. Most likely not. Most likely he was a predator that knew how to be non-threatening. Therefore, one could disregard the classic image of the slumming aristocrat in the top hat and the billowing cloak striding along in the London fog, considered instead the likelihood that he was a local man, indistinguishable from his neighbors, and unremarkable in his appearance. I wouldn't dismiss the top hat and the cane that he's talking about here. The exact words are billowing cloak. I wouldn't dismiss all of those things. I mean, that just means that someone is wearing those types of clothes. It doesn't necessarily say too much about his exact titles. There was, however, no apparent pattern to the murders. They were spontaneous, opportunistic slayings. Such predators always scour the same area, starting at home near the extended killing ground. As they grow in confidence, he may have felt compelled to return to the scene of his crimes to gloat or relive the frisson that it had given, a factor of aberrant behavior that the police at the time would have been unaware of, and otherwise they might have kept an eye on the sites to catch him. That's a fair point, and okay, maybe not all killers return to their crime scenes to gloat, but it seems like there's a high chance that the Ripper did. According to John Douglas and Roy Hazelwood, the choice of victim together with the nature of the mutilations indicates that the perpetrator might have been abused by a domineering female who had raised him, and as a result he would have vented his rage by mutilating animals, bullying other children, and eventually committing arson. And in other sections of the book that I've read, Paul Roland is going to talk about how committing fires is a very normal part of serial killer behavior. It's even included in the McDonald triad: setting fires, bedwetting, and hurting animals. And one of the reasons, though, why children might set fires, actually, is to draw attention upon themselves, actually. They feel that there is this type of need for attention that they're not getting from their parents, so they set fires just to get somebody to notice them. And that's what Paul Roland states here in the book, Killer Psychopaths. I think that that could be true some of the time, absolutely. All of the time? No. And also, People who commit violent acts aren't necessarily doing it for attention. They're also doing it to just create a series of events and see what happens. The same way that some kid might be playing with blocks or playing with toys. They might be hurting people, hurting animals, or burning things just to see the course of events that they've created. Some of that is power, but it's also just indifference to well-being. And I've noticed that happens very frequently with serial killers and psychopaths. These acts might have brought attention of the police, and while he was in his youth, he may have had a file that would be worthy of looking into. Oh, meaning that Jack the Ripper could have been a delinquent? Perhaps. I mean, if we don't know who the Ripper was, I don't think that's out of the question. The fact that all the murders took place between midnight and 6 a.m. indicates that the Ripper most probably lived alone and would have had few, if any, friends. He would have had a menial job, such as a slaughterman, that would have given him the opportunity to indulge his sadistic impulses undetected, and this occupation might have also provided the excuse that he needed to be out and about in the early hours without arousing suspicion, or even having blood on his clothes. Well, this is something that is in complete contrast to Dr. Thomas Bond's report. These are the words of Paul Roland, author of Killer Psychopaths, but he is stating very clearly that he thinks that Jack the Ripper was a slaughterman. Dr. Thomas Bond said absolutely to the contrary. This guy has no idea what he's doing when it comes to the removal of organs, but as we see here, it's possible. And I'm kind of 50-50, though, on the part about how he would have had blood on his clothes, therefore he was a slaughterman. I mean, if he lived alone, then he could just hide the bloody clothes as soon as he got in. There could be so many explanations. He could have also removed the bloody clothes in a secluded area and just trashed them before he is returning to the home if he has family. He could have had a change of clothes stashed nearby. There's so many things that would suggest, or that there's so many things that could be alternative possibilities. Armed with these details, Douglas and Hazelwood felt confident in eliminating some of the prime suspects, such as Sir William Gull and Montague John Druitt, who drowned himself in the Thames shortly after the last murder. And I have episodes about both of these individuals here on my Jack the Ripper Suspect playlist. Somebody was asking about the playlist here on Black Box Online Radio, and I have a Jack the Ripper playlist for the letters, but I also have a Jack the Ripper Suspect playlist, which has several dozen episodes now, and I invite anybody to check that out. And again, it also has episodes on these suspects, Sir William Gull and Montague John Druitt. Both of these people, I think, were absolutely not Jack the Ripper. Having reconsidered the evidence, they both agree that the most likely suspect was a Polish vagrant named Aaron Kosminsky, though John Douglas has subsequently qualified his conclusion by saying the most likely suspect was someone like Kosminsky. Well, that's when this book was written. In the early parts of 2025, John Douglas also made a very public post on social media, mind you, not like through any press release, where he stated that his suspect was indeed Kosminsky, and he thought he was right about it. From my own research, I felt confident in ruling out Kosminsky for the following reasons, and let's hear Paul Roland's claim. Aaron Kosminsky was born in 1865, and he died in 1919. He was a passive imbecile who scavenged the streets for scraps of food in Whitechapel, and did not exhibit any form of violent behavior at the time during his adult life. The strongest evidence against him was the belief that he had been committed to Colney Hatch Asylum shortly after the murder of Mary Kelly, but this is not true. He was actually committed in 1891 when the doctors described him as apathetic. If he had been capable of committing murder, he would have done at liberty for 3 full years from 1888 and onwards. Now, here are some problems, because as you guys know, followers of Ripper Wednesday will know that I definitely think highly of Aaron Kosminsky as a Jack the Ripper suspect. You can challenge me on that if you want, and no, I don't think the DNA evidence from Russell Edwards and his shawl have anything to do with it, but I do think that Kosminsky could have been Jack the Ripper. I'll even say it again. Aaron Kosminsky might have been the real Jack the Ripper. And this is almost beating a dead horse at this point, but the Aaron Kosminsky of 1888 might not have been the Aaron Kosminsky of 1891, and it was actually Paul Begg who made these observations very clearly in one of his Ripper books when he stated that the observations about eating food out of the gutter and the phobia of bathing were observed in 1891, and it's been just shared in multiple places across the world of Ripperology, and that seems to be the contemporary understanding of Kosminsky, that he was someone who might not have exhibited those behaviors in 1888, and also that Kosminsky was an imbecile. Well, I certainly don't know what Aaron Kosminski's IQ was, and I don't think Paul Roland does either. I certainly don't know what Aaron Kosminski's intelligence and street smart capabilities were, and I don't think Paul Roland does either. Kosminski was a familiar figure in the East End and would have been recognized if he had been seen near the vicinity of the murder sites. Well, Kosminski was also Jewish. Maybe somebody was covering for him, and also the Hasidic Jewish law of how one person cannot testify against another person. You need two witnesses to testify against someone. Several witnesses have reported seeing a man of shabby genteel appearance, which suggests a working man whose clothes had seen better days, whereas Kosminski was a dirty, disheveled vagrant whom even the victims would have avoided. Are you sure that they would have done that in 1888? And also, this whole thing about Aaron Kosminski didn't commit murder after November 9th of 1888 if he were Jack the Ripper. Did Jack the Ripper commit murder after November 9th of 1888? It's possible. There could be the attack on Annie Farmer, which was also in November of 1888, the murder of Rose Milet on December 20th of 1888, the murder of Alice Mackenzie, the murder of Frances Coles. I mean, there are crimes that happened after the Autumn of Terror. The Whitechapel murders go all the way until when? 1891. But to be honest though, like, I'm not convinced that any of those were Jack the Ripper, to share what I really think, but just to say that Aaron Kosminski hypothetically could not have committed murder up until 1891, well, this is an unsolved mystery. How do we know that that's what happened? And furthermore, he didn't speak any English, whereas several witnesses claim to have seen one of the victims shortly before their death talking to a man who does not appear to fit Kosminski's description, who was heard to speak softly in English. Now, this is perhaps the biggest error in the entire book, and that is that Aaron Kosminski did not speak any English. Aaron Kosminski was born in Poland, and going off of memory, he came to England when he was 16 years old, and he would have been 23 years old at the time of the Whitechapel murders, and that means he would have been in England for 7 years. Even though he was born in Poland, the language that he would have preferred to use would have been Yiddish. But I'm going off of memory, so I believe I heard this on the Jack the Ripper Tour YouTube channel, that Aaron Kosminski did indeed speak English, because he even had to appear in court once, and he was able to provide explanations in English, and even made a joke about he couldn't work on the Sabbath because it's against the Jewish law, and he made people laugh, so he had enough of an understanding in the English language to understand a judge, and also to even use humor in the English language. But if you look through other sources, like even on casebook.org, it would say that, okay, Aaron Kosminski may not have been fluent in English, maybe he didn't have the strongest command of the English language, but it does appear that Aaron Kosminski could speak English to a reasonable level, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if he gets to England when he's 16, and he spends 7 years living there. And this is not somebody who's showing up when they're 75 and they don't care about learning. Someone who was 16 might have been able to learn English in 7 years. I think that that's entirely reasonable. In his place, I unearthed a previously unnamed suspect who fitted the profile and was similar to the type of Kosminski. My suspect was a butcher who lived in the heart of the Ripper's killing grounds. He matched the physical description given by several key eyewitnesses. He had contracted syphilis from a prostitute for whom he said to have had a violent dislike. He was, too, eventually committed to an asylum and died after Scotland Yard had officially closed the case. Okay, and this is the end of the Jack the Ripper sections that were created by Paul Roland. Now, I can only guess that his suspect is Jacob Levy. And I think that Jacob Levy is a very interesting Jack the Ripper suspect. Jacob Levy is also a suspect that I strongly consider. But I've talked about them a lot here on this channel, and I also have a standalone episode on Jacob Levy, so I don't want to go over everything once again. But this is also in complete contrast to Dr. Thomas Bond's report. Levy was a butcher, and Levy had contracted syphilis, specifically neurosyphilis, from a prostitute, and that had altered his brain, so to speak, so he would have been dealing with schizophrenia-like symptoms. But this would have been someone who worked as a butcher, who had the anatomical knowledge, and would have been skilled with a knife. Dr. Thomas Bond definitely disagreed with that. And I would like to know, what do you think about any of the observations made by Paul Roland in his book Killer Psychopaths? I think that the claims about Aaron Kosminski are very general, and perhaps if you had spent 2 hours on the internet, you might be able to form a similar set of observations about Aaron Cosminsky. And I don't mean that you would agree with everything, but that's kind of what I'm hearing now, the same sort of thought process. Very general, not under the surface at all in relation to Cosminsky, but I'd love to know what you guys think. And I told you during the introduction that I also wanted to talk about Steve Ballmer's appearance on the House of Mystery radio show where he was talking about his book, Inside Buck's Row. And Steve Ballmer is somebody who doesn't even want to call Jack the Ripper by the name Jack the Ripper, just the Whitechapel murderer, because there is something that is cutesy about the Dear Boss letter, which gives Jack the Ripper his name, that like the name that we know him as, and I fully admit that. But as far as the comments that were made by Steve Ballmer, he is someone who does think that Cosminsky is a very strong suspect, but he was also talking about how and why people begin to think about the Ripper case in the general public. For example, from time to time, the media is going to run wild with a Jack the Ripper story. We've seen this multiple times with Russell Edwards claiming that he found some DNA match that solves the case. And the interview that I heard was from 2020, 5 years ago at the time of this recording. And at the beginning of this year, 2025, they're also talking about Russell Edwards and his DNA match with absolutely no new information. And I'm like, this could have been made yesterday. It's just, that is a distraction. Russell Edwards released the book naming Jack the Ripper in 2014, and it has been a distraction ever since because it doesn't certify Kosminski's guilt, it doesn't eliminate him as a suspect, it provides nothing but confusion, and that's ultimately where I stand on that issue. But there's another individual out there whom I've already mentioned in this episode, and her name is Patricia Cornwell. What happens with a lot of people is they look at the Ripper case, and they begin to think, okay, well, if somebody's getting their name mentioned in the papers and they have all of these claims about Jack the Ripper, maybe the Ripper case has been solved. And Patricia Cornwell's suspect was named Walter Sickert. And what Steve Ballmer was saying on House of Mystery is just that she is someone who is a very famous novelist. I agree with that. I think most educated people in America who have graduated from a university will know the name Patricia Cornwell. I've not read any of her novels. The only book that I've read from her was Portrait of a Killer, which I have an episode about here on this channel, and I invite you to listen to, talking about Walter Sickert as a Jack the Ripper suspect. But because she is so famous, she gets shared all across the media spectrum, the newspapers and in magazines and on TV shows, and having her own documentary, which you can find here on YouTube for free. And because she was so widely shared and discussed, a lot of people throughout the world began to believe that her observations were correct. But they're not necessarily correct. She just had one possibility. That's just one suspect profile. That's just one scenario. That's just one set of events that have been laid out, that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper for all of her observations because of them. And I completely agree with that. I'm absolutely not convinced that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper. And the next point is actually something that Patricia Cornwell has shared, but Steve Ballmer would be in agreement with, and that is that Jack the Ripper might not have needed anatomical knowledge to commit the crimes, because if you watch Patricia Cornwell's documentary about Walter Sickert, she believes that the Ripper was just on top of the victims, stabbing them and pulling out their organs without necessarily knowing what he was doing. Steve Ballmer provided a little bit more detail in what might be happening, saying that even though it's possible that Jack the Ripper did not write the letters, it's also possible that he got that name for a reason, because the Ripper isn't only stabbing the victims. He would have been on top of the women, plunging the knife into them, and dragging it in a downward motion. And that would have created a very large opening. And what Steve Ballmer was saying is that he's probably just grabbing a hold of something. He might not have even been aware of what organ he was grabbing. And then this would have led to a set of beliefs that people would have about the Ripper's education and background. Dr. Thomas Bond definitely disagreed with all that, but this was even brought up during the House of Mystery interview, that it is established. You heard in your own words that Dr. Thomas Bond believed that the Ripper did not have medical knowledge and anatomical knowledge. But Steve Ballmer points out that not everyone agreed with Dr. Thomas Bond. Dr. Phillips believed that the Ripper did have anatomical knowledge, and he was somebody who had the understandings, perhaps of either a medical doctor or of a similar profession. So these profiles are not perfect. They are guesses. They are educated guesses that people have created. And this is also goes to show that things can be misrepresented by the media. And it's not only about how a story is shared and becomes very popular, so lots of people believe it solely because it's popular. That happens. But sometimes misinformation can go out in the media. And perhaps one of the biggest pieces of misinformation that was discussed not only on House of Mystery, but also on the Rippercast is this whole concept of the From Hell letter was mailed and contained half a kidney. And then the media starts reporting that Dr. Thomas Openshaw stated that the arteries in the kidney completely matched up with the arteries that was taken from Catherine Eddowes' body. And then Dr. Thomas Openshaw had to respond to this publicly by stating in a press release that, no, I didn't mean any of those things. That's not how I wanted my words to be interpreted. I don't believe any of that stuff that about the arteries matching up and it's from an adult female who was around 45 years of age. He's like, I didn't intend for my words to be taken in that way. I didn't say that stuff, but the damage was already done. People have taken that and they've run with it. So exposure, large amounts of exposure can sway people's thinking. Misinformation can go out there. And a lot of the newspapers at the time just simply didn't seem to think that this was a problem. They didn't really care as long as they were selling newspapers, as it seems looking back in retrospect. But I would love to know what you guys think about anything that's been discussed in this episode. What do you think about the story of Dr. Thomas Bond and his report? What do you think about Aaron Kosminsky as a Jack the Ripper suspect? What do you think about the comments made by Paul Roland and his book Killer Psychopaths? And what do you think about the popular conceptions of Jack the Ripper? I would love to know what you guys think. You know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. You can also get me on TikTok and Instagram at blackboxned88, and I use those pages to release shorts and reels, which come out Monday through Friday, and I'll see you guys over there. Until next time.